For many years, Ryerson University in Toronto has been known as one of the best schools in which to study retail location theory. And today I'll be speaking with Dr. Joe Aversa, an assistant professor at Ryerson's Ted Rogers School of Retail Management. His current research interests and teaching responsibilities include retail location decision making, big data analytics, retail planning, and location strategy, all the topics related to the focus that we in this podcast always try to focus on, which is where geospatial technology meets business. Stay tuned.
So Joe, yeah, great pleasure to meet you and thanks. And as I said, I really appreciated Ryerson's commitment to business geography. And so, I've known it for many years, one of the best schools to go and study retail location theory. And I'm kind of curious, what kind of students are drawn to the program, and how do you sell them on a career in geospatial technology?
Well, that's the hard part, right, Joe? It's not easy to get the students sort of, I guess, hyped up in terms of what they can do with GIS, and especially within the business side when they're in high school. And that's just because there's a curriculum divide. In high school, geography classes are very different than what you would get, at Ryerson. And because of that, there's always been this sort of detachment. So it's not an easy thing to get them to be aware. I think the big selling feature is just the practical side, right? Being able to teach students how to leverage spatial data that can literally help with decision making, regardless of what the discipline is. And I think that's where you just kind of start off from, and then you always have those the students that will naturally gravitate towards the business side. Ryerson's well known for their retail stuff, and so that's kind of but it's not an easy thing to get the hype, to get students hyped up about it at the high school level. Once they're in, it's a different story, but it's about trying to get them in. That's always a bit of a challenge.
When they come in, are they coming in as like geography majors, or are they actually focused on retail studies and getting the whole picture about retail?
Yeah, well, it depends on the program. I'm no longer in geography. I've actually moved over to the School of Retail Management. Mm-hmm. So it depends. If they're in retail management, there's there's data visualization courses, and there's classes that they're required to take that teach them GIS. In the geography program, where GIS is sort of embedded in the curriculum, those students, they basically come in directly into a geography major, or what's called the geographic analysis program, where they then can choose a stream in retail, right? So there's individual streams that they have access to, and then they can make decisions based off of in terms of the types of courses that they're more interested in. And one of the largest categories is that retail side.
So I'll tell you a little personal story, and hopefully you can appreciate it, or at least laugh out loud. But when I was selecting my major in college, I was trying to decide that should I be a geography major or a geology major? And I went to the library and I picked up a geography book. I turned to this page with a ton of equations, and I thought, math in geography? No. So I ended up becoming a geology major and eventually ended up my way over to here. So all those ideas of spatial interaction models have all come back and now have been planted in my brain. But what kind of a student really goes into this and gets immersed in the kind of the math side, as opposed to just maybe the more qualitative side?
Yeah, I think that's there when you have any student that comes into a program, or they're looking at, let's say, a geography degree, I think that in Canada, the curriculum, the geography curriculum, in terms of what people are taught in the high schools, doesn't have that focus. And so when they tend to come, they come with the anticipation that it's going to be lighter on the math, on the math front. When they get there, and as you start to get into some of the modeling, then you start to learn about these things. But I think I think the commonality that you require from any student that comes in, and I think the thing that draws students to it is that just that knack for that spatial thinking, right? To think about things from a spatial context. And then that sort of, those other pieces kind of come in later, right? In terms of, teaching some of those fundamentals or maybe, what can be considered, the hard, the harder courses in terms of like having to teach them how to model and how to teach them, those intricate math equations.
Right. How do you balance that with teaching them the fundamentals and then bringing in the tools like a GIS system? And where does the emphasis lie? Because there are some universities that have a GIS major, and I often thought that that's the wrong way to do it. Right? You ought to teach the discipline first, and then teach the tool. I mean, what's your perspective?
Yeah, I think you're 100% right, Joe. So I've been in meetings with I'm obviously don't have to tell you this, but GIS as the diffusion of GIS has been spectacular over the last 2 decades. It's harder to find businesses that do not do GIS than versus ones that do. And the reality is a lot of people that are leveraging the software and the technologies and the methodologies are not necessarily people that have gone through formal education in those areas. And I think so from my perspective is that software packages, right? The software side of things is meant to make it easy, right? The easier it is to utilize the software, the more likely you are to sell a lot of licenses. And there's a bit of detachment in that. And so I am very cautious in just teaching a set of skills within a software package. I think it's more important to understand what you're putting in and how to interpret some of those outputs. My favorite examples is people love hotspot maps, right? They love seeing these different types of maps that show maybe concentrations of customers or whatever it might be, right? There's a nice visual effect that it provides. But if you don't understand what clustering is or how it's evaluated or how it's measured and what it actually means for there to be a statistically significant cluster, then all of that legwork or all of that, whatever the output might be, right, could lead to, individuals making bad decisions or misinformed decisions.
So there's really 2 frames in mind, and I'm really curious about your opinion. We have the map as a metaphor. It is a great visualization tool, but sometimes the map is not needed, right? There is the underlying spatial query that we generate. Sometimes it looks good on a map.
Yeah.
And that's right. But and so what we often say is, wow, without seeing it, you really can't understand it and appreciate it, as opposed to seeing it in a spreadsheet, right? Like there's all that data, but when you see it on the map, it's great. But sometimes the map isn't the answer. So I'm curious as what you see.
Yeah, I think if we think about GIS, there's always this end result, right? Like and for most people, the end result is the map. It's the end of the analysis. It's the piece that you use to visualize. But there's lots of methods that make awful maps for interpretation. So, for example, like HUFF models. If you do a HUFF model, and you try to map the different neighborhoods, or if you're doing it for multiple stores, it becomes very difficult to sort of visualize these things. And I think it's as much an art as it is a science to be able to convey that message, right? To actually convey whatever the findings might be of these, the spatial results of whatever it is that you've done. I think it's there's a lot of different software packages out there that allow for automation, that make it a little bit easier. There's different ways to digitally view mapping. So there's lots of different tools that now exist that make it a bit easier to visualize data more effectively. But yeah, I mean it's a problem, and ultimately a lot of decision makers, they like the map, right? They like that end product that can help them drive a decision. But yeah, it is definitely a fine balance between finding a useful map as opposed to just producing something that's a lot less effective.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And teaching things like the HUFF model is I think provides a really good foundation. I sometimes show a picture of the HUFF model in presentations to people who have no idea what GIS is. So I try to scare them with the equation, right? And a long time ago, I had the great pleasure of knowing David Huff, And he always used to say, don't call my model a gravity model, right? He was really adamant about that. But one of the things that you should understand about it, about whether it's a gravity model or a HUFF spatial interaction model, is we ask these spatial questions every day. We just don't know that we ask these spatial questions. And do you think students lack a fundamental understanding of how to think spatially?
I do. I think it's probably the most difficult thing. Like I can teach anybody to do something. Like if you know, if we had a one-on-one time, I could sit there and teach you how to make a map. I could teach you how to you know, utilize, you know, a variety of different software packages to be able to do things. You know, I can teach that to my children, my young, you know, my 6-year-old daughter. I could sit her on my lap and I can have her make a map. You know, it's not you know, that's not the challenging part. The challenging part is the ability to think in a spatial way, to ask spatial questions and to think spatially first oftentimes. And it's not an easy thing. You know, I remember sitting in a class with a bunch of business students, and this many years ago. And I remember there was a case that we were given, and part of the case was to identify why this company had failed. And, you know, so there was a bunch of business students, and everybody, we kind of went through each individual student. Every student was like, oh, it's, you know, you know, it was a marketing issue, or it was, you know, an operations issue. And it kind of went down the list of all these sort of business related, you know, reasons why it failed. But not one person in that group, like, or in this class, really thought about the geography of it, right? The spatial reason why it failed. And I remember sitting there thinking to myself, like, that was the first thing I thought about. Like the first thing that kind of crossed my mind was the geography piece. It's like, well, what are the spatial implications of this business that might have resulted in its demise? And I think it's not an easy thing necessarily for a lot of people, and some people don't gravitate towards that. But I think it's, you know, especially for students that are coming into these types of programs. For example, I teach a lot of retail management students. A lot of the problems that they encounter are geographic problems, whether, you know, it's, you know, a supply chain issue, whether it's a, you know, a marketing, you know, element that we're investigating or talking about, or whether it's, you know, site selection, or, you know, doing market-based analysis. All of these things have a spatial characteristic to them, right? So it's just really about, you know, trying to get the students to think about those kinds of things first, and then think about how everything kind of feeds into that spatial lens.
Where do you think retailers are today in their adoption of the technology, and maybe more specifically to the sophistication that they're employing? Do you find them going beyond dots on a map and, you know, 3-mile trade areas and all that?
I think the answer to that is yes and no. So like you have, you know, you're going to find retailers that are at the head of the curve in that regard, and are probably adopting, you know, more sophisticated kind of methodologies. I actually looked at this with my PhD work a few years back, where I surveyed a bunch of businesses to see where they were in terms of, you know, the use of spatial big data and these new technologies and new methodologies that kind of exist out there. And one of the things that I found was that for the most part, a lot of these businesses were still doing the same old kind of, you know, data crunching and the same method, you know, using the same methods, the same technologies that they were in the past. I think one of the fundamental differences is that the nature of their data has changed. Also, the reliance on data has changed. And so, you know, the majority of what they collect is geographic data. They have these repositories that, you know, maybe historically they were, you know, weren't being leveraged as much, or weren't being embedded in the decision-making process as much. And we're starting to see that change a little bit, in the sense that, you know, it's rare to find someone making a decision, whether it's about, you know, where to open up a store, or you know, whatever, maybe it's a marketing initiative within the store, without being informed by the data that they have access to. And so that's, I think, where the big change is sort of happening, is that there's a greater reliance on it. With that said, there are some businesses, you know, I know of some, you know, financial sector, you know, businesses, you know, a few companies in terms of general merchandise retailers that are quite sophisticated in the way that the way that they analyze their geographic data. And what we're starting to see is really sort of high. It's no longer you walk into these places and it's like ArcGIS is or MapInfo, ArcGIS is what we have on our machines, and that's what we're leveraging. What you're starting to see now is, you know, all of these different types of visualization tools that they have access to create these, you know, interactive dashboards, or different ways to house the data and to be able to call on the data and to mine the data. And it's really this sort of we're starting to see this sort of marriage between the data scientist and the geographic analyst. And so, you're starting to see that with some companies, but I don't think it's necessarily widespread in terms of all businesses. And yeah, I mean, there's still some, a decent amount of reliance on the traditional.
So to the earlier question, do you teach them more data science, or do you teach them more retail location analytics? And maybe that's a loaded question because there are, I think, obviously two these days, right?
For sure. So the way that I teach my students, because a lot of the students that I do teach are not data scientists. So I use this iceberg example, Joe, where it's like I'll draw an iceberg on the on the board in the class or on my virtual notepad while I'm teaching, and I'll draw this iceberg and I'll show the surface of the water, and they'll see like 90% of the iceberg's beneath the surface, 10% above the surface. And then I draw this little box that covers the top part of the iceberg and about maybe 10 to 15% beneath that surface. And I teach them that they need to be aware of everything that happens underneath, like the true data science kind of stuff that's taking place, and they need to know how to communicate that. But for the most part, these are not data scientists that we're training specifically in these types of programs. But that's not to say that we don't have anybody like that. There are students that do have interest in that, and they push that envelope a little further, but for the most part, at least for myself, I can speak for myself, is I stick to that top part of that iceberg, slightly beneath the surface, the rest of the top in terms of like, the whole body of data and decision making kind of techniques that might be available. So that's where they sort of live, and then that's kind of where the way I structure my content in my courses.
Yeah. Well, maybe just one final question. So where are students finding the jobs? Are there jobs available for your students these days? And are they getting good pay and they're recognized as a necessary asset?
Joe, and that's the big selling part of our program is specifically of the geographic analysis program, and even of the retail management program now that I'm being part of, is that if you're looking for people with the retail skills as well as the geospatial skills, as I mentioned, it's harder to find retail organizations that do not do GIS versus ones that do. And so there's a huge appetite for individuals with these skill sets. And so from an employment, from an employment perspective, this has never been sort of the problem of these types of programs or students that have these skill sets, because there's always been a place. And specifically at Ryerson University, we are known for this. And so a lot of these retailers will actually, reach out to look for our grads for those types of positions. And there's from the employment side, that is where I think a lot of our students excel is on the exit. It's taking the skills that they learn within their 4 years and then applying that into the workplace. And that's why, we've been so successful at pushing out grads and having them, employed relatively quickly and in positions that are reflective of the education that they've been, given over that 4-year degree.
Great. Yeah. Well, like I said, I've always admired Ryerson and what a fantastic reputation it has. So thanks again so much for your time, Joe. It's been a great conversation. I think it'll be great for people to hear what you had to say.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet. Yes. Take care, Joe.
Thanks again for joining us on another On Point with Karem. And if you like today's podcast, please leave a comment in the comment box where this podcast is posted, which could be Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. I hope you'll join us next time for another On Point with Karem, where we'll get on point.